Good morning. Welcome to the first session on the last day. I'm happy that so many people made it in, managed to roll out of bed, or maybe you haven't been to bed yet. So I'm here to talk to you about standards in Microsoft. First of all, I wanted to kind of introduce myself. I'm Chris Wilson. I'm Group Program Manager in the Internet Explorer Platform and Security team. I have actually been a browser guy for a very long time. I started working on the web in 1993. I was one of the two authors of NCSA Mosaic for Windows. And this picture was actually taken at the very first web developer conference in '93. And my team loves to throw this up in demos and stuff, so I figured I'd bring it in and show off. I have actually, I guess, fallen over to the side since then. I also worked on Spry Mosaic. Spry was a company in Seattle, did a product called Internet in a Box, and then went from there to Microsoft and the Internet Explorer team. I've actually joined the team right before we shipped Internet Explorer 2.0, worked on every single version up through 6.0, actually did a stint in the Avalon team, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and sort of compare the WPF framework along with the dynamic HTML one. And then, of course, rejoined the IE team about a year and a half ago. In general, I've really been very much a web standards guy during the course of my tenure on IE. If you look at a lot of these specifications, HTML and CSS, my name's on them. I'm on the good side. I was the guy who actually convinced Microsoft that we should implement CSS in IE 3.0. In fact, I'm the developer who implemented it at the time. On the bad side, I'm also responsible for overlapping bold and italic tags for my NCSA Mosaic days, so don't think I'm invincible or anything. So what I want to cover in this talk, first of all, I want to define a few terms around standards, kind of give us a common dictionary to talk about different types of standards, what open means, what proprietary means. I want to discuss that, actually, what proprietary versus open is, what some of the good and bad points of each are. State a little bit about our commitments, particularly around Internet Explorer, since that is my team, so obviously I know the most about it. But more than anything, this is an open discussion. I'm actually not going to talk all that long in the presentation. I'm more interested in having a lot of feedback from you and getting some ideas on what you'd like to see from us and where you think our priorities should be. So first of all, standard. I'm not going to go into the OED definition. You can read it if you care. The most important thing is when I talk about standards in this talk, I'm talking about a declaration of a set of features, a specification that you can measure an implementation against. I'm talking about web standards. I'm not saying my company's standardizing on Windows XP or something like that. Specifically about the web standards that put together the web that we all work with. There are four terms that I think are interesting to sort of define this and communicate about it. De jure, de facto, open, and proprietary. And by the way, it is de jure, it's not du jour. I actually posted my talk with du jour in it. It took me 2 tries to get them to fix it. And then internally, I think one of our guys blogged about my talk and still called it du jour. It is not standard of the day. It actually is by right or according to law. This is sort of declared. When you have a standard that's actually declared to be the standard, the thing that you should use. Generally, this is by a consortium, or it could be a government even, for that matter. Someone who has the authority to declare this is what's going to be used. These are often, but they're not always, openly developed. And I'll get into open in just a minute. But they're not quite the same thing. Sometimes de jure standards are actually developed privately and then ratified as a standard. De facto, by comparison, is really, it's in practice. It's what really happens in the real world. If you look at de jure standards that are used on the web today, obviously HTML, CSS, XML, all of these are de jure standards that actually are declared to be the standard by a consortium, by a group of companies. On the other hand, if you look at some of the de facto standards that are in use on the web today, there's tons of them, right? I mean, Flash is a great example. PDF is a good example. ActiveX is actually a pretty good example. It is used on the web fairly heavily in a particular way. And one much smaller example that I thought of recently was the document.all collection in IE's object model. This actually started out as something very proprietary. It's something that only IE did because we developed it in IE 4.0. Now other browsers are actually starting to implement it in addition to the object model that is in the W3C spec. One of the interesting things about de facto standards, one of the things that changes the character of them compared to de jure standards, is they grow to become adopted as a standard. They don't actually start out that way, right? I mean, the first time Macromedia released Flash, it didn't instantly become used in a large percentage of the websites out there. So one of the things that this causes, first of all, they're frequently, they start out at least as proprietary, but one of the things this causes is very strong backwards compatibility needs. If you grow over time to become a standard, you actually have to make sure that you still work with the previous versions, and that can be a sort of a challenge in development. So open and proprietary. As I started thinking about open and how I would define open, I realized very quickly there's actually two different definitions, and they're not really hard linked. They're sort of related in a sense, but they're very different. The first and most obvious one is open exchange of ideas, right? Openly developed. More than one person, more than one group actually participated in developing the standard, and if anybody wanted to, they could jump in and help develop it as well. The biggest challenge with this, of course, is always how do you balance participant input? Like, if I get onto a standards group and I really badly want one thing to happen, and another person on the group wants something entirely different to happen, how do you balance that out? How do you choose? One of the biggest challenges there, actually, is that we may have different goals about how we want to use the standard. Even in the CSS working group, I know we've had some challenges around, we've had printer manufacturers and mobile device manufacturers and desktop browsers involved. The goals of those different constituencies are actually pretty different. But secondly, open can also mean open for anyone to implement or royalty-free. And if you look at the W3C and how they've moved to have a patent policy, they're trying to move most of the groups, if not all, really to royalty-free patent policy. The challenge here, or the important thing here, I should say, sorry, is declaring whether something is open, whether it's royalty-free open or not, is extremely important. At Microsoft, obviously, we know a little bit about getting sued. We've actually started realizing more and more that our patent portfolio is very important as a defensive measure, really, to make sure that other people aren't going to try to sue us for things that we've infringed upon. And getting the patent policy of standards out in the open is really important. I mean, when I started working in the W3C and working on web standards, we were all just sort of participating in it and going along and implementing things, putting them into the standard, not really thinking about whether anyone owned IP on them or not. Now, though, it's actually quite important to think about if we do own IP there, if someone else owns IP there. So proprietary can mean two things also, and they're sort of related to the open things. It can mean I own this, right? You have to obtain a license from me if I even give you one. If you look at some of the de facto standards that are out there now that are proprietary, you may not be able to re-implement them without actually obtaining a license. It may not be legal. You may be infringing upon intellectual property. But of course, proprietary can also just mean privately developed. JavaScript, for example, originally privately developed, right? It was originally developed by Netscape. But others may be free to implement that, and in fact, over time, it may actually move into an openly developed or certainly openly maintained standard as well. So obviously, one of the questions that I always have to answer for working with some of the public is, why don't we just do everything openly? Why isn't every standard an openly developed one? Why isn't everything royalty-free is a totally different question, actually. But with openly developed standards, and this is something that I always say internally when convincing people that open standards are actually a great thing, There are tons of people participating in the development of that standard. And there are, as I put on the slide, smart people everywhere. Not all of them work for Microsoft. I think we all have figured that one out. But you get the influence and experiences from a wider variety, not only of people building implementations, but also different consumers. It's actually, I think, been a very powerful thing in the CSS working group that we've had such a variety of different people, different backgrounds. We've had printer manufacturers, we've had mobile device manufacturers, we've had web designers on the group, and that's been very helpful. Finally, you also get better interoperability across vendors. Obviously, if everyone's participating, developing the standard at the same time, you get a lot better interop. On the downside, you can get a design by committee mentality. There's less direct ownership over the entire standard. There can be less drive to participate, sometimes a challenge to get people to do their jobs in a committee. And the participants, as I sort of hinted at before, they may simply have different goals. They may want different things out of the standard, and trying to reconcile those can be the challenge. With proprietary standards, and I understand some people think that that's a paradox or a contradiction in terms, but it really isn't, right? A standard is just a criterion or measure. A proprietary one is still a standard. You can actually set yourself up to solve only a limited set of problems, or solve a particular problem, not try to be all things to all people. You can maintain a coherent design. You can maintain coherent goals. You don't get this design by committee throwing things in on the side. You may have your own vision of the future, and this is somewhat related. You may actually want something very different than the other people who are participating in an open standards working group. And as I think some of the guys in the What working group have figured out, you can move faster when you have a smaller set of people, when you have a more limited set of goals. And of course, for some people, it's a lot easier to maintain intellectual property in this way. But the downside, you only get a private set of perspectives. You only get one implementer, most likely, who's actually thinking about how you will actually implement it. You only get one set of goals as well. Like, you may not be thinking about what happens in a print manufacturer world or what happens in a mobile device world. So how do you innovate in this world? How do you innovate inside an open standard in particular? Sometimes you actually try these out in a proprietary way first. There are billions of examples of this that I'm familiar with, or pretty close. One of them is the border radius that's in Mozilla. They implemented this, I think, in Mozilla 1.0, and it's actually been added into CSS3. It's likely it'll get ratified as part of the open standard. May change somewhat in the process, but it's relatively simple, so it probably won't. If you look at how the document object model was developed, a lot of that was actually the very early core was developed in Netscape. Then a lot of this was developed in IE 4.0, and then we worked together with the DOM working group to build an open standard around that. And with that as an example, sometimes things start out as proprietary, and then they're donated to open efforts. But in the process, they also frequently change. If you look at the IE object model that we shipped in IE 4.0, compare that to the DOM level 2, they're actually pretty different in a lot of ways. Certainly the eventing model is fairly different. That is because in that process of creating an open standard, there were a lot of other perspectives. People thought things should work differently. Netscape at the time had a very different eventing model, for example. Different way of doing capturing and bubbling. And their way of doing things, we came up with a compromise that actually included bits of both, but it was pretty different from what we'd originally shipped. And sometimes there end up being a proprietary version of something and a de jure standard version of something. RSS and Atom is a really good example of this. So RSS started out really, Dave Weiner said, hey, I want to capture my blog in an XML feed format. Came up with RSS. A lot of people started adopting it. It just sort of grew as a de facto standard. Atom, on the other hand, group of people actually sat down and said, let's think out exactly what we want in an XML feed standard and ratify it first, and then we'll all start adopting it. So there ended up being differences between RSS and Atom because of the way they were developed, even though they are somewhat rationalizable, I guess, to create a new word. And of course, sometimes, as with Atom, you do this, the whole thing is an open effort from the very beginning. XML is another example of this. We all sort of sat down and said, hey, we really want some way to declare things in a structured way, but we want to have the freedom to change what the schema is later, to declare what the data structures are later. One of the interesting things, one of the funniest experiences I've had in working with standards for so long is when XML 1.0 was actually released to the world. I remember there was a long article about it. I think it was in CNET, I can't remember, but they quoted some small business owner as something, it said something like, you know, I think this is great, I love to see new web standards. I just hope Netscape and Microsoft don't pervert this like they did with HTML by adding new tags. Obviously didn't get the idea of what XML was about. Just very, very odd. So a lot of this conference is talking about AJAX, and I wanted to talk about whether AJAX is a standard or not. So this is kind of the description of AJAX from Jesse James Garrett's original adaptive path essay. And with the parentheses, parenthetical comments are mine. But AJAX isn't really a technology or standard. It's several of them used together, each one of them being a powerful thing in its own right. It incorporates, though, standards-based presentation, XHTML and CSS. Both of those are de jure standards, obviously. Dynamic interaction using the DOM. Largely, the DOM is a de jure standard. There are some bits of proprietary bits, or proprietary or de facto things that people use. Data interchange and manipulation, XML and XSLT, obviously de jure standards. XML HTTP request, an interesting case I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but a de facto standard at this point, and the de jure standard of JavaScript binding everything together. So in 1998, we actually said, you know what, we really need this way to transfer XML data over the internet. Like inside a web page, we need the ability to say, give me a new chunk of data from somewhere else. So we developed this XML HTTP request object, and unfortunately it took quite a few years, but kind of took off in usage. And other browsers started picking this up and implementing it. In fact, implementing it in a slightly better way because they put it into the native JavaScript APIs rather than having to fire up an ActiveX control and manage it and that sort of thing. And now, of course, the W3 has created a couple of working groups, one of which is going to look at creating a de jure standard around this idea, hopefully in a somewhat compatible way, since most of the browsers implement it by now, but we'll see. So I want to switch gears for a minute, lay out some of the principles of how we think about standards, particularly in IE, but across the company in some ways. First and foremost, and we say this constantly, but I actually do really believe it as an employee of Microsoft, we've always responded to what our customers demand. One of the first things that I did when I rejoined the IE team a year and a half ago, I wrote a blog post on the IE blog, and I said this, in effect, but I also said, and web developers are our customers. And I think that we hadn't really stated that clearly enough before, that we were actually listening to what web developers and web designers needed and wanted. If you happen to catch the Future of IE panel that we had on Monday, one of the points that Dean started out saying, that I also believe in, though, is that there are balance points around that. Although we're committed to making the world better by improving our standard support in IE, we also have to balance this with backwards compatibility. This isn't an excuse not to improve. It's just a challenge that we have to face when we do improve things. And, of course, we have to balance that along with security and a ton of other things as well. One of the hard parts about working at Microsoft, from my personal perspective, is we have this rule of not pre-announcing software. We don't want to set up expectations of, on September 28th, we will release a new version and it will support this. Because if we don't actually live up to that, then people get understandably somewhat upset. And because we're so big, they get really upset. And in order to not have to face that, we basically just say, you know, we will give generalized guidance, but we won't pre-announce exactly what and when we're going to do something. However, on the IE team in particular, we're trying to become a lot more open in communication. We've actually seen a lot of people favorably impressed by this. I think that's great that they get that we're using the IE blog as a way not just of kind of letting the team say, hey, we're human, we actually sit there and code, and we pay attention to test suites and that sort of thing, but that we actually do have some goals and some principles, and we'd like to share them. We'd like to actually have that be an open dialogue rather than sort of the closed internal one that we may have had in the past. This isn't really new. We've actually said this a number of times. I just dug through and found one of the more recent ones. In April of 2000, we said, you know, in effect, standards are kind of the core of the internet. Standards are critically important in developing the internet browsing technology, and standards are the key to that. But of course, as Dean also addressed in his keynote speech, we kind of went away for a little while from some people's perspectives, starting in 2000. One of the biggest reasons for that, honestly, was security exploits actually grew really profitable, so a lot of people tried finding them. They got very, very sophisticated in their attempts to hack the system. And one of the worst mistakes, in my opinion, that we've done internally was we did this actually pretty feature-packed release of IE in Windows XP Service Pack 2. All of the features, for the most part, were focused around security, but there were a lot of them, and there were a lot of features that we didn't really package this or release this in the press as, hey, this is a new release, this is something that's great, it's got tons of functionality in it. We just said, oh, it's, you know, part of the service pack. It makes you more secure. Didn't really talk about what it did to make you more secure. But at the same time, in 2001, we started recognizing that dynamic HTML is kind of the foundation of the client app platform, the foundation of, you know, how you would build applications that today you build using Win32 might not really be the best thing. Number one, it doesn't really exploit local resources very well. I don't just mean doesn't give you local store. I mean doesn't run better on a machine with a better graphics card, for example. The performance of this may end up being pretty bad if you're trying to do very high bandwidth client interaction. And of course, the security model is a bit of a challenge. It's sort of dangerous to think of anything from the internet has the same access to my local machine that Win32 code does. But that just means it's more of a challenge to build a security model around that. And of course, tool support is always kind of a challenge. So that's when we really sat down and said, kind of need a new platform. That's when we started developing the Avalon project, or the Windows Presentation Foundation project. The biggest thing that we did there when we built WPF was we said, you know what, we want an integrated platform at a very low level for documents, UI, and media. And media in particular included 2D vector graphics, animation, 3D. There's one more that I was trying to remember. Just video and audio, really, like synchronized, frame synchronized video and audio from a very low level. And this is something that it's really easy to say, hey, I'm going to cram a video into my web page, and there's a little play button, and you'll get to see my news clip or whatever. Actually getting it frame synchronized across the entire platform with other things that are going on, getting animations to sync with the video is a lot harder if you don't start out with that as a goal of your platform. So this integration across all the media types is really pretty critical, but picked up a lot of lessons from dynamic HTML. Declarative markup language is probably one of the biggest ones. Developers loved this idea, right? They loved being able to say, instead of having to go play with a Windows resource editor or anything, I'll just write some declarative markup. And of course, as they demonstrated in one of the WPF talks I sat in, you can run things inside the browser, or you can have it as a standalone app on your desktop. And it's a tiny change to make this happen, right? It's a one-line change in a resource file. Now, AJAX-style development actually uses the current DHTML constructs, but it's missing some things that you really need for applications. Some of these are starting to get added. UI controls and layouts. For example, Mozilla has the Zool work that they've done that covers UI controls and layouts. application model, which is something that I think we're just starting to see, the idea that I do want to be building an app and it has to maintain data, for example. It has to be able to maintain and restore state. Doesn't quite fit totally with the web model today, which is very page-oriented. And I actually was talking to someone in the hallway earlier today. They found me and we just walked up and said, hey, I'm having this trouble with history. I don't have the ability to go back and make that be an easy operation to maintain state. But there are 2 new W3C working groups, both of which we're working to get on with our legal department to work on these standards. The standards for both the application programming interfaces to do application model type web programming, and the formats, doing things like UI controls and layouts, for example. So I want to move into the open discussion portion, but a few thoughts to kick this off. First of all, there are a lot of formats out there that make up the web. Not all of them are actually open. Some of them are de facto, some of them are de jure, some of them are proprietary. But as people are building web apps today using Flash, I think would agree, sometimes that de facto or proprietary tool is actually the right one for the scenario that you're in. However, open standards, and particularly the W3C open standards and IETF open standards, have always formed this interoperable core of the web. And that core, and this is actually an important statement for me to make, I think, over time, that interoperable core increases in size. More things get added to it. If you looked at where the web started, it was HTML 1.0. It was something Tim Berners-Lee kind of just wrote down in a piece of paper and had some code that supported something that looked vaguely like it. But we've moved on from there. We went through HTML 3.0 and 4.0 and XHTML and CSS. XML HTTP sort of got added into that with Ajax. And things like SVG are actually increasing that interoperable core as well. I think those new standards are actually important to get added into that interoperable set. So finally, we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. I did want to say, if you had any thoughts on this that you wanted to talk to me personally about, that's my email address. Feel free to send me an email. Obviously, it'll take me a couple days to get back to Seattle. But with that, I think I'm going to open the floor. There's 2 microphones. Go ahead and step right up. Oh, come on. I know we didn't all go out and party last night.
You got up first. Okay. So of the interoperable core increases,
Mm-hmm.
you've already supported XML, XSLT, HTTP request. The one you haven't supported yet is SVG.
Yep.
So when and which subset?
Am I going to have to flip back to the part where we don't pre-announce software? SVG obviously is one of the things we've been asked about repeatedly. I put it on the slide for a reason, to introduce the idea. We have actually heard that. We've heard that it's a request. There's a lot of work that goes into doing SVG well. There's actually even a lot of work to figure out which version of SVG to support. Actually been talking to some of the other browser manufacturers about that. Can't really tell you when. Not in IE7. Going to have to blog about that again because I saw the blog comments yesterday. But it is something that I think is becoming important to be part of that interoperable core.
So I know you're not going to say when. So I just want these on the list somewhere. I want before and after, content, CSS3 pseudo elements.
Table display type.
Display table. Well, I told you that over and over again, but I want
That'll
to
help you out,
on
Kevin.
video. So.
Those are actually all on the list, yes. I think when I say CSS2, CSS1, CSS2, CSS 2.1, that's sort of part of the point, is that interoperable core does need to increase over time. And we sort of have this disjoint bit around the HTML, CSS, SVG-ish type web standards that we did kind of go away from increasing our support of for a few years. We are definitely back at that. I think that if you look at what we've done in IE7, we actually have made tremendous leaps forward in what we support, how well we support it, actually. I've actually been really happy with what the team's gotten accomplished in that time.
Are there any plans at Microsoft to implement XSLT 2.0?
An excellent question. Are there any questions to implement XSLT 2.0? There actually are in the server side, I believe, but I'm not sure how quickly or how well that's going to translate into the client-side development. I'm actually kind of interested to hear what the scenario that you want to use it for is. If you can let me know what that is, I'd be interested. More questions?
Hi. Microsoft used to be a driving force for HTML and CSS evolution. There are a lot of tags, Microsoft-specific tags in standard right now. CSS features like collapsible borders in tables, I believe it's Microsoft invention. And
I think I introduced that one.
So I can see that last year Microsoft is not working in W3C actively.
Interesting.
What happened?
I'm going to point down to the gentleman in the front seat here who is just shaking his head because he reports to me and is actually on the CSS working group and has been spending a tremendous amount of time on that lately. I don't think actually that you will see we had a great question on Monday in the panel about, hey, it's great that you're picking up this standards work, but when are we going to see web innovation from you guys again? I do think that you will see that. We spent most of our innovation efforts, I guess, in IE7, to my way of thinking at least, in security, which actually is a great place to innovate in, again, to my way of thinking. I do think you're going to see a lot more in the platform, but it's also kind of harder to see it if we're working in this open way and we're helping drive the standard. By the time we stick that code into the product, it actually is part of the standard by design. But I will say we have been actively working in the W3C. It can be kind of challenging to do that just because there is a lot of effort that goes into that. Having been on all of the working groups that I mentioned before, takes a lot of time. And at one point, my job was largely standards working group guy. Getting that into the product is also really critical, though, and setting that up right on my team has been one of my challenges for the last year.
The second question is, Internet Explorer version 7, is it still Trident engine or something different like from what you did for Mac?
IE7 is still based on the Trident engine. We've actually done a tremendous amount of work, obviously, inside the Trident engine to support things like doing overflow properly, for example. That was kind of a big challenge. Even one of the first features that we did in the platform in IE7 was properly doing the alpha channel feature of PNG images. And this was something that a bunch of people who'd been on the team before had said was next to impossible inside the Trident engine. And we actually had one of our devs go in, think about how the system was structured, and figure out how to put it into the system and have it working. I think it took them about a week to do that. So I think there is a lot of flexibility in that engine, having worked on it, obviously, for a long time. There's a lot of good code in there.
And the third question, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Third question is, what do you think about the future evolution of HTML? HTML is.
I think it would be a good thing.
Oh yeah. It's. I just don't understand why Microsoft is focused on the user interface in HTML. HTML is for like paper-oriented media, I guess.
Sort of, yeah. When you think about what HTML was originally designed to encompass, it really was designed to be a semantic document language with a bunch of weird forms things crammed in there because they were good to use, right? Because they were sort of necessary. I think that the idea is that two separate but somewhat similar efforts have done in separating out the forms controls parts. Obviously, I'm talking about X forms and web forms. I think that's a good idea, to think of that as sort of a separate semantic schema. But I also consider that part of the domain that I consider HTML, even though it's not really HTML. If you look at how the W3C is structured, they actually have a group lead that's over HTML that, blanking on his title, unfortunately, but it's basically the UI lead, the semantic schemas for document and UI constructs lead. And I think that I'm not as interested personally today in innovating on a better way to do paragraph headings or something like that. but I kind of think of those as the same vague area, I guess.
Sorry, and the last, are you going to combine sometime in future probably Windows Presentation Foundation and HTML in one entity?
In one what? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
In one entity, in one like language. I guess that is going to be extension or something.
I think one of the one of the interesting things is that the way that WPF is designed, it really is markup that reflects code. And if you think about how HTML is defined, and for that matter, really any XML schema, it's more, there is a semantic schema that's associated with a document structure, and then that document structure may be translated to something else, right? The parser may actually instantiate other things, or you may apply style sheets to it and end up with a display tree internally. And the model that's in WPF is very different. It really is reflect the code objects that need to get loaded. It doesn't have as heavyweight a parser in that sense. I do think that you will see tighter integration in the future between WPF applications and HTML, web, AJAX-type client applications using web standards. I don't think that will really be at the level of just mingle the tags together and everything will work out, because I don't think they're designed that way. I think they actually are two separate entities from that perspective. I think you were standing up first.
Okay. Chris, we've seen a lot of stuff over the last couple days that showed us some pretty compelling benefits for using XAML, both inside the browser and outside the browser. And especially in light of the availability of the everywhere flavor of WPF and the possibility of having this stuff running on, shall we say, non-Microsoft platforms. Can you comment on XAML as it falls into your whole spectrum discussion of standards, open proprietary, how that all plays out, kind of where we would be heading with that?
Where we would be heading with it. I would, obviously today, I would say that since it hasn't been released, can't really count it as a de facto standard. Certainly isn't a de jure standard. Certainly isn't really open either in terms of development. I do think it's a proprietarily defined standard. Whether that moves into something that is open in terms of licensing, particularly in the WPFE, that I really do have to refer to the Avalon guys, right? They do own those decisions. Yeah?
With the web formats and the web API stuff in W3C, does Microsoft have any position right now in preference? Reflecting a previous question of, is HTML the right language for UI, or should there be something like Azul? And then there's on the other part of the web app formats group is XBL, and there's a component model that's missing from the AJAX world, which you have, is a fantastic one in WPF. And is that something which Microsoft feels is necessary to add to the AJAX world, or not?
Okay, so the first question, is HTML really the right place to build UI? I think HTML today, certainly not the right place to build UI. We actually did this at Microsoft. Windows 2000 actually shipped the add remove programs component, was built using Trident as its rendering engine. And that was a mistake, I think, in retrospect. It actually didn't perform very well, had a few rendering problems sometimes. The weight of the engine was actually pretty heavy for that scenario. But a lot of that was because it was missing particular constructs. And when I think of HTML, you don't really think of HTML anymore, right? You think of this XML system that has a structured document storage, or has a structured in-memory document and lowercase d document, not a book, but some set of data that's associated as a single entity. And whether that's the semantic markup of paragraphs and emphasis tags and that sort of thing, or whether that's something like Zool, where it really is UI layouts and controls that plug into that. I guess when I think of dynamic HTML being part of the core of that application programming language, I'm not thinking of you're stuck using bold tags and divs. I think you're you're using this XML system, you may be plugging in different schema that are missing, that are necessary, and that is a lot of the things that are in Zool, for example. Won't comment on the precise controls in their set, because there are a lot of them. But they did add a few very obvious layouts that you need for UI. In fact, if you go and look at XAML and you compare the layouts that are in there and several of the controls that are in there with what's in Zool, you'll find they are actually fairly similar. I think those are the pieces that are missing to make this, I don't even want to call it HTML anymore, right? To make this dynamic client AJAX platform actually capable of building applications, not just hacking application UI up using HTML as a rendering language, which, by the way, it wasn't really designed to be. So your second question, component model. The web, let me get this right, the Web Application Formats Working Group does actually have as part of its charter to do a componentization model. So maybe it's Web API. I'm confusing the charters off the top of my head. One of them is supposed to do a componentization system. XBL is obviously an interesting input into that. XAML has a pretty good componentization model. Again, the challenge with XAML is it really is designed to be this reflection of code, not a markup that gets processed and you construct code objects because of that. I do think component model is actually an important piece to add into this overall system. Obviously, we actually did the very early versions of this using behaviors and using view linking with binary behaviors. There is one additional piece, too, which is a lot of the other things that are in the Web API working group, like the conversation that I had this morning, for example, actually being able to hook into the history system and the travelog, be able to design what the navigation model of your application is, and not be linked into using just the web page system that we currently have. If I want to be able to bookmark a specific place in my application, in my favorites, I should be able to do that. If I want it so that I can click forward and back and not actually have to do a navigate every time, but navigate inside the currently open application, again, I should be able to do that. So I think there are a lot more things that do need to get added to the overall platform. Yeah?
So two questions. I'll do one, let you answer that, and then do the other one. So the first one is that it sounds like there's a whole bunch of kind of cool ideas for IE8 that are coming out.
Absolutely.
So what's your prioritization?
We're not releasing every 3 months, though. I think somebody brought that up in Dean's keynote.
Good.
We do want to be on a much tighter rolling schedule, but...
So what's your prioritization model for that, and how open and explicit are you going to be with that prioritization?
I think how openly and explicitly. I think that, as I said, we do want to be a lot more open about that. I think that we will come out and actually say, this is what we're prioritizing relatively soon, actually, for the next couple of releases of IE. I think that Bill mentioned we are actually working on multiple versions of IE at the same time, or planning for multiple versions at the very least, so that we do understand we have a long-term roadmap. Not quite ready to share that yet, and obviously there is always a huge, huge peanut gallery for that, but I do think that we'll be a lot more open about it and a lot more explicit about how we're prioritizing. If you look at what we've done in IE7, we actually have been fairly explicit about how and why we prioritize the way we did. For example, why we didn't pass the ACID 2 test in IE7. I think I'm not even going to bring that up anymore because I've already said very clearly, we prioritized around removing pain points for web developers and making their lives much easier. And that's sort of partly mapped to the ACID 2 test, and we're a little better, but that prioritization, we will continue to be more and more explicit about why we're doing things like that. Next question.
And I guess the second question is, the thing that worries me about all these AJAX applications is we've got this fairly grim Stone Age scripting language, which is kind of loosely typed and not OO and declarative and all this kind of, modern day programming. So a kind of plea for innovation would be, you're doing some nice stuff with the IL in WPFE, but maybe there's another kind of thing you can put in the script tag. I don't know whether it's link or F# or whatever, but something that we're not 5 years from now going to be cursing all these lines and lines of JavaScript that we can't maintain.
So I think there are several things there actually that I'd bring up, and no silver bullet, but I think that JavaScript over time is getting better as well, and it's not, at this point, or certainly at least several years in the future, it's not going to be the same language that we had in 1997 or 98, and that will make it better. Additionally, though, we've always actually supported different kinds of scripting languages, and at one point I was a developer on the object model team in IE, so I know how our system is set up, and you're not actually required to have loose typing, for example. As a consumer of our object model internally, and when I say internally, that's internal to the client system. You can actually plug in, using our exposed APIs, a new scripting engine that does have strong typing, for example. Whether we will actually do that or not, we don't really have a plan around. Like whether we will provide, for example, direct C# APIs onto our object model that don't go through this loose typing interface at some point. Haven't really decided that or not yet. Over there?
I wonder if you could talk about the IE7 release strategy and how that's going to appear to the end users. Is there going to be Windows Update involved? Is there going to be warnings? Anything about the marketing of it, and any predictions on its uptake and what you see 8 months from now?
I think that that's a tough one, and I'll be clear, I'm crystal balling at this point. I do think certainly Windows Update will be involved, I believe. I think it's important. We're certainly going to market it very heavily. It's also something that's not just a hidden update. I would not want my mom to flip on her computer one day and notice that, wow, her entire web browser is totally different than it was the morning before.
Will it be a critical update?
Great question. I don't think we've decided that yet. So I will say it is in our best interest to get as much IE7 out there as possible, just for maintainability, if nothing else. That adoption is actually critical to us as well, us on the IE team, not us as Microsoft.
What if it breaks some enterprise applications that people are using?
That's why backwards compatibility has always been one of our biggest challenges, and why it's been one of our biggest goals.
Even though it's not your fault, though. I mean, it's just the way some of these things are coded.
You sound like you've been on the IE team for a while, actually. Yes, it is a big challenge, balancing compatibility with actually moving things forward and taking the heat when applications break. And obviously, we're in that spot today because we've done a lot of, for example, CSS work that Marcus is going to talk about in an hour or two, and still breaks pages. Did the right thing. I don't think anyone in any kind of overview perspective would say that we're doing the wrong thing by fixing standards bugs in IE, but it still does break. You'll go to a major site. Like I was in the airport on the way here and tried to log into the wireless network, the Wayport network in SeaTac Airport, and I noticed there were overlapping content in the login page that made it really hard to use. It's because they're using hack somewhere. And
I saw one that was doing a browser sniff, and the warning of the application said, you are using IE 5.5.
That's the worst one.
You need to upgrade your browser.
I hate the browser sniffing one, yes. We will keep publicizing that and anything else that causes application compatibility. And actually, if you caught Rob Franco's talk yesterday afternoon or Marcus's talk in an hour or two, one of the key things that we've looked at is how to give tools to people to maintain their applications and to understand why they may be breaking, whether that's changes for security reasons or whether it's changes for standards improvement reasons. Over here.
What exactly is XML script?
What exactly is XML script?
We saw some of it in one of the earlier presentations.
Which one? Because my off-the-cuff answer is I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay. Atlas. Then
Atlas.
Send me an email and I can hook you up with the right person on Atlas. I'm fairly familiar with what they've done, but I'm certainly no expert on it.
Okay. Are there any plans to add declarative programming to the client side?
When you say declarative programming to the client side, which client side?
To the browser, basically. A lot of the Visual Studio work now on the server-side controls allows declarative programming.
Sort of depends how deeply you mean declarative programming. I'd actually say a lot of the stuff that we have today, and if you include the idea of doing componentization models, declaratively, doing a declarative componentization model, you actually can do pretty powerful things today. I don't know if we have radical plans to increase that I'd bring up at this point, though.
Okay, and then one last thing. From a business perspective, if you're implementing web content for a web application using XAML, from Microsoft's perspective, what is the business meant to do for people not running IE? It seems like they're still going to have to make the investment in DHTML solutions or AJAX solutions, or else choose to slam the door on greater than 10% of the audience.
An interesting question. I actually think that they've thought about that, about how they run in systems other than IE. Not only, and obviously, answer one is, well, just run out of browser, and then, hey, it's like an application, right? It runs the same as any other application in terms of getting it downloaded to the system if you're running Firefox or whatever. However, I do think they have spent some time there. I don't know the exact details, but I know with WPFE especially, but also, for example, InfoCard, they've actually talked to other browsers, and they do have a roadmap for how they will work with other browsers. This isn't, I do think that our goal, certainly on the IE team, is to make IE the best way to experience the internet. But I think that across the company, other efforts that are related to the browser that might make up the browser as sort of a meta piece of software, they're not limited just to IE necessarily. We're over here next.
Yeah. Actually, my question goes into a couple of things that were brought up earlier, and it's around Atlas. And a couple of the goodies that Atlas brings are, first of all, bringing object orientation to client-side JavaScript. There's lots of goodies in there, like namespaces, inheritance, and all that kind of thing.
Yep.
And the second part of it is somebody earlier asked about XML script, and it's roughly analogous to what you could do in the JavaScript, except it's all declarative. And I'm here interested in knowing if any of this stuff is being driven towards some of the standards bodies, particularly the XML script. Is there any work on standardizing that? So it doesn't, instead of it being a proprietary standard within IE using a compatibility layer that Atlas gives you, whether it will actually someday become a de facto standard.
That is a great, or a de jure standard even.
Or a de jure standard.
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer. I'll have to talk to the Atlas guys and see what their plans are.
Okay, thanks.
Over here.
My question pertains to Windows Presentation Foundation. Even in V1, it could potentially be a replacement for HTML in the future. It has a declarative markup language that describes UI and attaches to backside code. And it seems also to me that Atlas is sort of an interim object model that's being developed for the purpose of taking the HTML-based applications that we have on the internet today and giving them application-like functionality that basically WPF will provide. Do you see in the future WPF actually becoming a replacement for HTML?
I think that question that's been asked internally and externally many times, I think, really depends on the scenario. I mean, I don't think that WPF is going to replace the, I don't think it can replace HTML per se, because it's not an open interoperable format. And I think that's critical as I said before, the core of the web, right? The idea that you have all of these systems that are interconnected across the web. If you look at some of the newer sort of application, I'm trying to think of how to put this. If you look at some of the new ways that applications are being built, the idea of building mashup applications, of integrating not just data, but actually components from disparate, not only different people, but different vendors, building things on top of Google Maps, for example, to use a non-Microsoft example for a minute. That's really powerful. And if you look at things like chicagocrime.org, where they take the database of crime in the Chicago area and Google Maps, mash those components together, and actually render it. My favorite Google Maps application actually got pulled off the web. It was implementing Risk on top of Google Maps. I thought that was awesome, right? I mean, somebody wrote the code to do the data storage and game maintenance of Risk, and then used Google Maps as the rendering system, the user interface system, I guess, the user experience system for this game. And when you think about how to build things like live.com, it's not just data that's getting moved around there, it's applications, and being able to mash up those together kind of presupposes that you aren't limiting to just one system. You aren't limiting to just WPF, or for that matter, just HTML either. I don't think that WPF ever replaces HTML in that sense. I do think there are some things built today in HTML probably will be built in WPF. The same way there are some things built in HTML today that, or there are some things built in HTML 5 years ago that are built in Flash today, or PDF today, or other formats like that. Over here?
Around standards and backwards compatibility, I was wondering if there was any collaboration between the IE7 team and the Office 12 team, specifically around SharePoint and improving maybe SharePoint's code base or whatever.
Certainly we do have a relationship with the SharePoint team, and we have been spending some time with them. They are, of course, wildly interested in compatibility for us. I know that, for example, we have an open issue today around SharePoint working really well, running under protected mode in Windows Vista. Still have to work out some of the details there. Did you have a specific concern with that?
I guess I was just sort of wondering, like, if there is collaboration, or if, basically the IE team has to support whatever the direction the SharePoint team goes in. I mean, the current SharePoint is...
I wouldn't put it that way, certainly.
Okay.
I do think that we're interested in compatibility for all of our customers, all of the people who build on top of the web system. SharePoint's a great example of that. Outlook Web Access is a great example of that. But there's also plenty of external examples of that too. Things that need to keep working. Google Maps, for that matter, needs to keep working, right? If we broke Google Maps by changing something, that would be a bad thing for the web, in my opinion, at this point.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
The idea about XML replacing HTML.
XML or XAML?
I'm sorry, XAML.
Okay.
Made me I'm a little confused, my understanding of how this works now. In the current implementation, where exactly is XAML turned into actual UI? Obviously, when we see an application where you change the size of the window and it changes from 3 columns to 2 columns,
yes,
that functionality does work on a web application as well. So this must be happening in the client side. Does that mean that XAML is flowing into the browser and the browser is making that?
So the way that this is integrated today, the way that XAML and WPF applications can run in browser actually uses all of the openly documented systems, the same systems actually that Adobe uses for PDF, for example, right? It uses this document object host interface to plug into the browser rendering area. It takes over the client area in the browser. The only thing that they've done a bit more integration work around, and that we've provided a few more interfaces for in IE7, is managing history, navigation, and travelog, because that was a key feature for WPF, was being able to integrate into that back-forward button experience.
So XAML is actually flowing in the browser and being converted directly into UI. It's not going through an HTML stage in the process.
Absolutely true, yes.
Okay.
It does not go through HTML. All of the rendering they own, they take over that client area. Anyone else could do the same thing in the browser as well.
Okay.
Question about support of JavaScript in IE7. In .NET you have JavaScript version 2.0, and in IE I believe you have 1.3, I guess, JavaScript 1.3. What will be in IE7?
In IE7, we're not upping the version of JavaScript. We've done some fixes in our system around doing closures and things like that to make the experience better. The JavaScript engine itself is actually owned by another team. They have been ramping up pretty heavily to make a much better engine, to look at what they need to do in the future. And we really do encourage feedback on what we should do with the JavaScript engine, in particular, what's interesting in JavaScript 2.0, whether E4X is an interesting thing, all of those things, and why. I mean, the scenarios that you want that sort of thing for. But no major changes in IE7 there.
It seems like each department in Microsoft is doing their own JavaScript engine, right? Because you have in .NET, you have in browser, and you have in some other place, I guess. Some small,
This is actually why the JavaScript engine isn't owned by IE, is because there is one JavaScript engine team.
Yeah, it's not, it's just command.
And we do try to all use the same one and componentize that, but of course that's always a challenge to have multiple people using the same engine. Other questions? Great, thanks for coming. Feel free to come up and chat with me afterwards too. I think we've still got a little bit of time, so thank you.